Okay, let's get started. Again, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here from so many different parts of the world and different kinds of organizations. We do encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat as we get started. I'm Mariah Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact here at Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. Today is one in a series of Insights for Action seminars that the Skoll Center has put on this year. And across the series, we explore how researchers and practitioners, both in Oxford and especially beyond, are using research insights for action and impact. These are conversations just like today's between researchers and practitioners working across disciplines, across sectors, and across different media to understand and create more equitable and just social, economic, environmental, and health systems. Today's seminar is focused on power, and in particular, drawing on the insights from the recent book, Power for All, How It Really Works and Why It's Everyone's Business, by Julie Battilana and Tiziana Casciaro. And we're joined today by three experts who are scholars, leaders, and activists, all working in, with, and trying to understand and effectively use power for positive impact. I'll introduce them briefly and then we'll get into the discussion. First, we have Julie Battilana, one of the authors of the book, and a leading scholar and educator, as well as an advisor in the areas of social innovation and social change. Julie serves as the Joseph C. Wilson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, and also as the Alan L. Gleitzman Professor of Social Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. And I'll just add a personal note. I've known Julie for many years, starting when I was in the graduate program at Harvard Business School, and she has been a wonderful collaborator, co-author, colleague, mentor, and friend over the years. So welcome, Julie. It's wonderful to have you here. We also are joined by Esther Benjamin, who is a global executive in the public, private, and civil society sectors across 25 years and more. And Esther is currently serving as the CEO and Executive Director of World Education Services. And as Esther and I have discussed on many occasions now, World Education Services is a social enterprise that does credential evaluation services for people in North America who are coming from other countries and need a way of demonstrating their skills, their accomplishments, and their credentials to gain employment. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Gail Bradbrook, who is an environmental activist and co-founder of the environmental and social movement Extinction Rebellion. And I'm thrilled to have all three of you here in conversation today. Just before we get started, two other notes. I want to thank several members of the Skoll team for their support in setting up this seminar, most especially Jessica Jacobson, who leads our research and insights portfolio and who's been instrumental in designing the whole series and pulling this one together in particular. Also, Lydia Darley, who keeps the administrative side of things in order for this seminar and much else at the center. And it's also Charmian Love, who's an affiliate of the center and of the school, who connected us with Gail for this event. So thanks to all three of you as well. Finally, just a note to encourage people not just to introduce themselves in the chat as we start off, but also throughout the conversation, post reactions, comments, questions in the chat, and we will be making time to address those along the way, both with written responses and in some of our discussion. Okay, I think that's all by way of introductions and housekeeping. So I want to kick off the discussion with a question for Julie to help us really understand the book and set the stage for the discussion across this hour together. Tell us, Julie, how you understand power and why it matters, and how we have often misunderstood power and what we need to rethink, if you will, particularly as we think about how power plays out at different levels between individuals, at the organizational level, and at the societal level.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for organizing this event, for inviting me to join, and thank you to Gail and Esther for joining. It's a joy and an honor to be with you all today, and thank you everyone for joining and being part of that conversation. I very much look forward to our exchanges. So what is power, Maria? So power is the ability that individuals, groups of individuals can have to influence other people's behavior. So power is a necessary ingredient for change. But this is a definition of power. And what I like to say is that this is not an explanation. The second question then becomes, where does power come from? And over the past 20 years of research, teaching, advising on power and the politics of change, my co-author Tiziana Cacharo and I have asked this same question, right? Where does power come from? To thousands of people from different walks of life, very, very different walks of life, in fact, and different parts of the world. And what we've come to realize is that while power is probably one of the most talked about topics, it is also one of the most misunderstood. In fact, what we've seen is that across the board, people tend to have deep misconceptions in mind about power. And these misconceptions have actually very serious implications for all of us individually and collectively. And so we've identified 3 widespread and recurrent misconceptions. The first of these misconceptions is this idea that somehow power would be a possession. So you'd be surprised if you could spend a day with me, because you would see that quite often people come to me with the same question. Like they come to me and they say, Julie, you study power and the politics of change, you teach about it. Could you please give me the list? And I was initially puzzled, kind of thinking, what list are you talking about? And then I got to understand that people actually want the list of personal characteristics that make people powerful, right? And some people believe it's about charisma, others would say it's about good looks, but they want the list. Though the reality is that power is always relative. You may have great influence in one set of relationships and not in another, right? So there is, in fact, no special trait that guarantees power across situations. The second misconception that people have in mind about power is this idea that power would somehow be only for the people at the top, for the CEOs, the top executives, the prime ministers, the presidents, the generals, and so on, right? The mistake here is in assuming that authority is a guarantee of power, right? The truth is that authority is different from power. It is the formal right to give orders and commands. And as such, in some situations, it can be a source of power, but in others, it is not a source of power, and it is never a guarantee of power. And in fact, in our research with Tiziana, what we found is that the most effective change makers in organizations are not necessarily the people at the top. They happen to be the central players, the people to whom others are going for advice. Why? Because these people are the people others trust, and trust is a huge conduit of influence. Now, the third misconception about power, that's probably the most widespread, and I have to say that I have the privilege of working with a lot of social change makers across sectors. And this is something that the more junior ones often have in mind. It is the idea that somehow power is dirty, right? People believe that power inherently corrupts, that it is necessarily corrosive to our morals. But power itself is not intrinsically good or bad, right? It's just the energy we need to get things done. The dirtiness, if anywhere, is in us. And that we are not going to deny. Yes, power can be dirty, but it's up to us to decide what we will do to acquire power, and importantly, how we will use the power that we have. So now, if these are the misconceptions, then the question becomes, okay, but what's the answer to this critical question then? Where does power come from? And so what we explain in the book, and that's what we refer to as the fundamentals of power, is that power resides in control over access to valued resources. And I'm going to make a big statement. I'm going to say that the fundamentals of power were the same thousands of years ago when human beings were getting organized to live together on this planet. And I'm willing to sign a document now saying that they will remain the same for as long as there will be human beings on this planet, assuming we get our act together and we save and protect our planet, right? So power resides in control over access to valued resources. This is simple and yet critically important. What does it mean? It means that, Mariah, I have power over you if I control access to resources that you need and want, right? And in the meantime, you have power over me if you control access to resources that I need and want. It could be you have access to a budget to organize the next big conference in the field of social innovation that I think should absolutely happen to help a number of my doctoral students and the younger generation. And if so, because you control that budget, you certainly have some power over me, right? Now, in the meantime, it could be that I'm connected to this amazing organizer you've been wanting to talk to for a long time because her work is tightly connected to the research you're doing. And if I'm the only person you know connected to that person, then I also have some power over you. So what is it that we understand when we understand the fundamentals of power? We get to understand that power is always relational, right? I may have some power in a set of relationships, but again, not in other relationships. So power is relative and power fluctuates. It's not because I have power today over you that it will be the same tomorrow. And power, by the way, is not a zero-sum game. We may both have power over each other, or you may have more, or I may have more, but that can change and evolve over time. At the end of the day, if we want to understand who has power and who doesn't in any kind of situation, there are two key questions we need to answer, and two only. What do people value, and who controls access to the valued resources? Now, and that's my last point to answer your questions, because you talked about connecting the levels of analysis, and you're absolutely right. The fundamentals of power do not take place in a vacuum, right? Power is relational, and these relationships occur in a given context. They are painted onto the backdrop of society, influenced by its history, its culture, by the stories that we tell each other across generations, and the legacies of the past. So all in all, your personal power and the opportunities you have access to can change dramatically, not just based on your talents, on your determination, but also based on the reality of the political, economic, and environmental structures that constrain or enable you. It would be foolish to think that we can pursue our personal objectives irrespective of how power is distributed in the broader society, right? The context is crucial, and we have to account for the role of power hierarchies.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Incredibly helpful introduction. And I see already a bunch of comments in the chat about people's views of power and how they resonate with what you've been saying. I want to ask you in particular, as we think about power as relational, and you used examples of between the two of us, right, or two individuals. But in the book, you also talk a lot about power, of course, at these other levels. And about what it takes to change power, especially at a societal level, through collective action. So tell us a little bit more about why collective action is so important, and what does it really take to change entrenched power hierarchies?
Yeah, so let's start with these power hierarchies. What is a power hierarchy exactly? A power hierarchy is an accepted order of who commands more versus less power in an organization or in a sector of society, or more broadly in society. The problem is that once power is distributed in a certain way, over time, the resulting hierarchy acquires a patina of legitimacy, right? It becomes what we think is the natural order of things. And we forget that other human beings created it in the first place. It seeps into the stories we tell to make sense of the world, into our culture, into our laws, and we come to see it as legitimate, right? We say business as usual when we should say politics as usual, right? And that's why we explain in the book that power is so sticky. But sticky is not the same as stuck, right? Now, of course, it is extremely challenging to change deeply entrenched, deeply rooted power hierarchies, but history and research on social movements have taught us that we can accomplish a lot if we organize collective action. And this is precisely what my co-panelists, right, Esther and Gail, are expect at what they've been doing, what they continue to do, and they are among the leaders in that world of organizing. So we individually may not have all the sources of power that we need to challenge these entrenched power hierarchies. Think about utterly unjust power hierarchies related to gender and race, for example, right? But if we join forces with others as part of collective movements for change, then we can significantly expand the pool of resources that we have access to. And this is precisely the power of collective action, right? What human beings created, they can together change. And so in my research, I've actually identified 3 roles that are necessary to effect changes that challenge the status quo when you talk about these deeply rooted power hierarchies. And so what are the 3 roles that I've identified? I have identified the necessity for some of the players, the people, the organizations to play the roles of agitators, for others to play the roles of innovators, and for others to play the roles of orchestrators. Agitators, who are they? The agitators are the ones who speak out against the status quo. They raise the public awareness, right? They highlight the problems. The innovators are the ones who then propose the solutions. They come up with an alternative to the status quo. And finally, the orchestrators are the ones who help implement the solutions at scale, right? They can be organizers, representatives of public authorities, members of civil society, and so on. What matters about these orchestrators is that they work as a collective to enable the coordination and collaboration of all the parties, binding these parties together in support of the change that they are pursuing. Now, all 3 roles are necessary to tip the scales of change. What's interesting, though, is that when you talk about movements with people, they immediately tend to go to agitators. And yes, agitators play a critically important role, right? They are the ones who put an issue on the public agenda. But agitation alone is not sufficient to bring about change. I'd like you to think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? For example, and we talk about it in the book. If you ask me, I would say what a highly needed movement in terms of agitation. And if you think about it, it was also quite effective in terms of agitation at the time. And yet somehow the movement died and didn't really lead to any kind of major changes, right, at the time. Now, if you ask me why, I'll share with you my interpretation based on my analysis and the data that I have. I would say that's because there was a great deal of agitation, but what the movement lacked at the time was a set of innovations they could push forward, right? To say, here is the new system, here is what we could be doing, right? And this is why I say that innovation and orchestration are critical too, because agitation without any kind of innovation is a set of complaints without a way forward. And innovation without orchestration is a potentially great idea or a set of great ideas, but without impact. Right? So it's critically important to agitate, innovate, and orchestrate. And there are situations in which the same people and the same organizations are able to play all three roles at once. But what we get to see quite often as well is that you have different people, different organizations playing these different roles as part of a movement. And a critical challenge that they face is that they need to coordinate. So the work of agitators has to help set the stage for the innovators and for the orchestrators. The innovators themselves have to be very careful in the sense that they have to be able to work with the proximate leaders, those who know about the problems, and co-develop together the solutions that can really help address the problems at hand without creating unintentional new problems along the way. And as for the orchestrators, they face the challenge of bringing everyone together without diluting the mission of the movement, while making sure that you reach the ambitious objective you want to reach, which for many of those movements, again, are all about changing the existing unjust power hierarchies so that we can create a society that's going to be greener, that's going to be more democratic, and that's going to be more just.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm seeing a few questions in the chat about understanding power versus authority and how we understand and define resources. I just want to acknowledge those, and we'll try to make time to either respond in the chat or come to those at the end. But I want to turn now to Esther and then to Gail to ask you to share a little bit about how this understanding of power as control over access to valued resources, as fundamentally relational, as depending on the particular context, and also as operating at these different levels. How does this understanding of power resonate with your own work in social and environmental movements? Let's start with Esther on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. And Julie, I have to say that your book is a gift. It's a gift for all of us working in the social sector and all of us working within social movements. It is timely and we needed this. It's inspiring. And it also gave words to so many things we think about but haven't read in writing. So thank you for that. I help run World Education Services, and we are a nonprofit organization working at the intersection of higher education, workforce development, and immigration. Over the years, we developed into a social enterprise, and we generate our own resources, our own revenues, and we have become financially well-resourced. We're well-positioned to contribute a meaningful role in a social movement. Our social movement is one social movement we belong to is focused on economic inclusion for immigrants and refugees. We understand the power we have as a well-resourced organization. Our other important resource is our team of about 400 staff who bring valuable lived experience. Another valuable resource we have is our track record, our brand, and our credibility over the years. We also understand the responsibility we have to use this power, as you say, as an energy force for good. We believe that we can't do this work alone, and collective action is what's needed. To that end, we are deeply engaged throughout the US and Canada with about 250 incredible partner organizations, incredible proximate leaders, incredible immigrant leaders. They're all focused on economic inclusion for immigrants and refugees. Building these networks towards a common goal is powerful. Just imagine 250 organizations led by proximate leaders driving a social movement. And to go back to what you say in the book, the approach we use is an approach of interdependence. It has to be an interdependent social movement. We also believe that we need a variety of tools to help advance our social movement. We are leveraging our financial capital for a variety of tools, a variety of means for advancing the social movement. We're using philanthropy, programs, partnerships, policy, and advocacy. And all of this with our partners focused on economic inclusion for immigrants and refugees. Now, we have to be grounded in how we do this work. The philanthropy has to be participatory. It has to shift power to communities that best understand the needs and priorities of those we work with. Our programs and partnerships and coalitions, we have to take an approach of co-creation to shift the dynamics of power. And in terms of policy and advocacy, the approach has to be about rethinking systems, laws, regulations, and change the status quo to reduce the barriers that immigrants and refugees face. So I think I would say that we partner with about 250 organizations across the US and Canada, and together we are truly interdependent in the social movement. And we do this with a sense of urgency because most of us bring lived experience to the movement. And it is truly interdependent, and it's shared leadership, and it's shared power, and it's focused on shifting power to our communities and those we serve.
Thank you, Esther. I think in that you've touched on a whole bunch of the things that resonate with what Julie said, and also some of the questions about the different types of resources that you've brought to bear in this work of building this collective movement, and also the ways in which power is used for good, right? And this notion of sort of debunking the myth that power is dirty, right? That actually power is a resource that we can all use for good. I want to turn now to Gail and ask you to share a little bit about how this understanding of power resonates with your work.
Yeah, thank you. And again, actually, I would like to also thank Julie and her co-author at this time. It was a really helpful book to read. I think the last 3 years, 4 years almost, since Extinction Rebellion was launched, has been a deep dive in trying to understand power at all these different levels, including personal power, including the power of social movements, including how power works within social movements, and also wrestling with this, I think, even bigger question of what the power is when it's at a paradigm level, when it's so entrenched in a system, and potentially when it's unleashed from any given person. And I start to wonder even where the off button is when you have the global financial system that was deliberately in some ways decoupled from democratic control. It's interesting to note that there are many people, I sometimes get to speak to business leaders who, by the way, behind the scenes tell me that we're doing a great job, but won't say it in public and tell us to carry on. Who actually feel really quite powerless to make the changes on the climate and ecological crisis. I mean, this crisis is a culmination of many things. And I think one of the sort of issues is to really understand why we find ourselves where we are right now, as the life support systems of the earth are reaching and breaching tipping points. So one of them is the AMOC that holds the weather patterns in place around the world, includes things like the jet stream that's starting to resonate and wobble, and means that it's likely that aspects of the food system will collapse. So, you know, scientists are talking about us being on a pathway to the collapse of civilization. It's quite hard to then think about, even, you know, with the power that one has, where it's best to deploy it. Is it to think about how to hold and be with a system that's on its way to collapse, or is it to try and make changes within the system? I found that model of agitate, innovate and orchestrate really helpful, and I think it's really important to think about that in terms of the climate and ecological crisis, because you know, as Julie was saying, there are people that can play different roles within that. I personally, and I know other colleagues think this too, think that some of Extinction Rebellion and sort of sister organisations have got somewhat stuck in the agitation mode and don't necessarily think it's for us to bring through the vision of the change. And yet, if we don't have a clear vision for where we're going, even if it allows for many visions within that sort of cosmo vision, as some name it, we leave ourselves open for a pathway that's towards eco-fascism, and I don't use that word lightly. I think the other sort of aspects of that model also map to social movement theory from people like Stellan Vint-Hagen, who's written a theory of nonviolent action and talks about 4 different aspects. And I think it's interesting when you can bring different aspects of that model together. So, for example, Stellan talks about utopian enactment. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it means the place where your actions of agitation also show the change that you want. I think probably the most beautiful example of that in Extinction Rebellion was around our April 2019 rebellion, when in the UK, when we had a pink boat blocking Oxford Circus, and we had a Waterloo Bridge blocked with community and trees and nature. And what we were saying is that nobody's coming to save us, we're saving ourselves, and that we're going to have a good time while we do it, and that we want to be in community together and with nature. And so the action also spoke to the inspiration, to the vision, to the innovation. The orchestration becomes interesting and also difficult. My sense is that we really don't have that level of collaboration on the progressive environmental left as one would hope. I have the sense that perhaps, and I'm not particularly fond of the sort of left-right polarities, if it's that simple, but to use that simplicity, I sort of have the impression from what I've read that the right is much better at, perhaps due to sort of cold logic, at thinking about orchestrating together. The neoliberal age was brought in through the Mont Pelerin Society that met and thought about what needed to be created and how it would sort of orchestrate a new sort of ecosystem for a new economic system that's been devastating on the whole. So I think one of the things maybe to finish with saying, another thing that the book talks about is some of the negative things that can happen with entrenched power. And I think you can turn that on its head and say, how does this work positively within a social movement? So entrenched power can have this enhanced sense of agency, and you can also have that in a social movement, because as Hannah Arendt said, the power lies in the collective. It's like a union, and when you feel that togetherness, that is the deep power from which social movements are born and express themselves, is this sort of collective power. And when you really sort of see your actions as legitimate, even when you're at risk of being seen to be breaking the law, many of us don't think we're breaking the law, we think we are upholding the law actually, but because we understand the depths of this crisis, and because we know our history of civil disobedience, there's an an ability and a desire to legitimize what we're doing. There's a feeling of civil disobedience being appropriate and people finding their own sense of agency in doing that. The relational is utterly important, and maybe we can move on to this in the questions, but one of the things that really unleashed the collective power within Extinction Rebellion was that we set our stall on decentralized organizing, and we learned something of that from the literature, people like, you know, Frederick Laloux's work on teal organizations, and we were said to be sort of at the leading edge of that, which meant we didn't know what we were doing a lot of the time, and we were sort of making it up. And one of the things we did was to try and implement a system to some extent called holacracy, that's often used in decentralized organizations. It has a lot of value, and certainly we've learned a lot through that. I don't know if this is true, but I was told that the person who created holacracy was on the autistic sort of dimension, and did not understand that power was very relational, and so sort of hidden power and accountability, feedback systems, and so on were not necessarily seen as important because it came through a role, when actually, as Julie said, so it's essentially relational rather than role-based. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gail, for these reflections. And I think it actually leads nicely into the next topic we want to discuss, because you talked a lot about the various ways that you and everyone at XR was really a student of power in some ways, and it's students of organizing. And Julie, I think in the book you talk a lot about this issue of why it's important and how it's useful to really understand power if you want to have impact. And you have some wonderful stories there, including stories that I think address some of the questions we're seeing in the chat about how do we understand what resources are, what resources we should try to accumulate, and how can we use them without becoming corrupted by power. So I want to turn it back to you to start us off on this discussion of, you know, why is it important for us to be students of power, if you will?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, and thank you for all the questions. Well, you know, both Esther and Gail have very eloquently talked about the current situation we're facing, and we're clearly facing a multidimensional crisis. We've been all experiencing a tragic health crisis related to the pandemic, but this crisis has also, you know, further highlighted and deepened social and economic inequalities on the backdrop of an imminent climate catastrophe, right? And so it is as urgent as ever that we reimagine and redesign our social and economic systems if we want to create a society that's going to be greener, that's going to be more democratic, and that's going to be more just. But for that to happen, we need power, because without power, we'll not be able to make any kind of change happen. It's the energy we need. So if we want to be part of any of these changes, if we want to be part of, you know, like all this collective effort to redesign our social and economic systems, then we have to be students of power. In fact, research actually shows in our field, Maria, in the field of organization studies, I'm thinking about the excellent research by our colleague David Kracard that, you know, we mentioned in the book. Research shows that the ability to see power, that's the ability to understand what is valued in the context and figure out who controls the valued resources, this ability is itself a source of power. And this is why we wrote that book, Power for All. And that's why we also entitled it Power for All. Like 500 years ago, more than 500 years ago, Machiavelli wrote a really important book about power for a prince. We wrote that book for everyone, including those who've been excluded from power for a long time, with the objective, the mission of democratizing access to knowledge about power. And you're right to say in the book, we use a number of stories. You know, one of the stories we share is the story of Latasha Brown. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Latasha Brown. She's the co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund. And she is, and they are at the Black Founders Matter Fund, they are deeply aware of the necessity to help people become students of power. Right? I'm sure you all know the organization that Latasha has co-founded was not only part of the momentous effort to turn Georgia blue in the 2020 US presidential elections, but they also work with communities to leverage and build their power. And so Latasha and her co-facilitators work with the communities to identify the key issues that affect them. And then they work with them to enable them to better understand power on the ground so that they can build the power they need. so that they can, as proximate leaders, shape their communities in the ways that they know are going to be most helpful to the communities. And so as we think about why it's important to be students of power, what I want to do is not only give examples of, like amazing people like Latosha, we have Esther and Gail with us today, but I also want to talk about the implications of what happens if we ignore power? What happens if we're not students of power? Well, I actually, in my teaching and in my advising, I've had the privilege of working with social change makers from across the world. And what I've come to witness quite often, in fact, is what I characterize as the technical trap. That's when change makers start thinking that they can help address the environmental problems, the social problems, the political problems we're facing with technical fixes only. And that's when they say, so here is the technical fix. And you know what? I don't want to have anything to do with power because that's the ugly side of things. Let me concentrate on the technical fixes. Well, here is what happens when we concentrate on the technical fixes. We fail. It's showed by research. We know that from our experiences. We fail because we then do not navigate the politics of change the way we should to be able to push for the changes. And so that's why it's critical to be students of power. And so I indeed want to clarify one last thing. When I said that power resides in control over access to valued resources, I should have immediately clarified the critical point, and thank you so much for the question. Yes, we human beings tend to value money and material possessions, especially under the neoliberal system that has been dominant over the past decades, but these are not the only resources we value. We also value psychological resources, and we talk about that at length in the book. And when I talk about psychological resources, I talk about achievement, autonomy, status, affiliation, and morality. And if you think about morality, that's actually, one of the reasons why social activist organizers are able to galvanize people and rely them, because they stand for moral values that some of us want to be associated with. So thank you so much for enabling me to clarify this critical point about resources.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. Just back over to Esther and Gail for any reflections on this question of being a student of power, and in particular, perhaps maybe share with us from your own experience and that of your organizations, how you've avoided the technical trap, if you will, or moments when you've fallen into that and recovered from it and really been able to navigate the politics of change, as Julie has called it.
Shall I go, Esther? Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. So, firstly to say it was a really big learning journey for me personally about personal power, that in environmental social movements, as has been highlighted, it can often be seen as a dirty thing. And then suddenly you are somebody who has access. We talk about having access to power rather than holding power. That already makes a statement that you're sort of doing something and stopping other people having it. The absolute essential nature of learning. So Extinction Rebellion defined 10 principles and values. I did most of the writing on those before we were launched, and we talked about feedback and learning, debrief and reflection as being a key principle and value. But actually, in all honesty, with many of our principles and values, we don't actually know how to do them. And so we sort of worked out how to do non-violent direct action versions of civil disobedience tactics. But how do you do feedback and learning across this decentralized organization that, by the way, became in sort of 75 countries really quickly, grew into over 100, 200 groups in the UK, and how do you sort of cope as an individual with that access to lots of power within that, with the amount of feedback that wants to come your way that's you barely have the capacity to cope with? It was quite overwhelming. I had some really helpful coaching and reading, and we ran a project called the Systems Realignment Project, which analysed our functioning as a decentralised movement and gave some particular pieces of feedback about how we could make improvements. So, for example, access to information is an important piece, and there is a plethora of not only WhatsApp, Facebook pages. Everybody communicates differently. It's a sort of mess. It's a beautiful mess. and simply to, you know, organize movement-wide gatherings on a regular basis would be a way of allowing more access to information, as an example. I also found it helpful, a different book, but just to mention it, Leadership on the Line, which is from people working out of Harvard, who talked about 4 modes to failure, which was that you can easily be distracted, marginalized, attacked, and seduced when you have access to power. It's also keeping your focus and keeping your sense of purpose. I think understanding how teams function and be able to support teams to work well is, you know, what happens in a movement like Extinction Rebellion is you have people who will work till, you know, literally all night. I had a guy from the FTSE 100 who was an MD who said, I've never been around a situation where you've got people who are still working at 4 in the morning on police station support for no money because they believe in the mission. But what you've also got with that is people operating on having all sorts of roles within XR. We haven't got collective shared understanding of team working, of how we want to work together, of how to do these collaborative practices. So we've had to try and backfill on many of those things. And on top of that, as a social movement, it's very likely that we've been infiltrated and deliberately tried to be undermined from the inside. So I would say, actually, in sort of a good way, it is so important to get the collaborative practices and the agreements and the systemic agreements together about how you want to work together, because they help to at least design out infiltration behaviour and counter insurgency measures. So I think being a student of power is really important. I perhaps leave it there, but maybe on another moment, there's a lot more to say, I think, about the power that's within this system and how we might address a domination paradigm. But I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Gail. And I think we will come to that next. And it also resonates with a comment from Susan in the chat about the way in which at the Equality Fund, they work to really use their power to amplify that of their partners, right? To think about the power that is in the system that can be amplified and elevated rather than my power or your power. But before we go into that discussion in more depth, let me just turn to Esther. Any reflections on this notion of being a student of power from your own leadership experience?
I love the idea of just ongoing learning about power. And while it may be one of the age-old topics, I think we have to come back to it and re-examine it and remain a lifelong student of power always. And I think we have to keep in focus that the balance of power is shifting all the time. And we can also rebalance power. And our individual context is changing. The world is dynamic and the resources that are valuable are changing. The narrative, the story is shifting, and we can also shift it. And it's clear that our organizations can be more or less powerful over time. And I think we have to be curious about what's changing and how it's changing and how our work needs to shift to remain relevant and powerful and to continue to affect change. I'll give an example. Mariah described our organization as one that does global academic credential evaluation. That was the historic purpose of the organization. And we provided this valuable service and we became a social enterprise. But there was a point at which we re-examined the world, what we do, and we said, social enterprise for what? Okay, we do these academic credential evaluations, but people have to use it to access jobs, to access additional educational opportunities, to access regulatory system and licensing. And that's when we shifted the organization by studying and power mapping and figuring out that we could use this incredible set of resources that we had, the track record, the financial capital, the connection, the relationships to other organizations. And that's how we shifted to devoting resources to programs, to philanthropy, to impact investing, to supporting policy efforts across the continent. So without being a student of power, without being an organization that understood its power and its potential and the way we needed to shift, we wouldn't be where we are. But we've got to keep that curiosity and to keep asking the questions of our own organizations, the movements, the world, so that we can study, examine, shift, and continue to affect more and more change.
Okay, thank you, Esther. I think both of these last two sets of comments from Esther and Gail have really kind of teed up this issue of thinking about your role and your organization's role in the context of systems, right, and systemic change. And Esther, you really nicely described, I think, sort of the shift from thinking about how do we execute as a social enterprise a particular mission to how can we think about our role as, you know, perhaps in part an orchestrator, right, in a system where you're trying to bring together a bunch of different actors and organizations with whom you're connected to bring about a broader set of changes in the system as a whole. And I think this raises these questions about orchestration in particular, and Julie, this is obviously an area that both of us have done a lot of work in, which is, you know, and Gail commented on the ways in which that, you know, that and the orchestration work can be particularly challenging, you know, perhaps maybe more so with the progressive organizations on the left, if we will use that term. And challenging in part because there's often differences in values and in trust across organizations, even if they're all broadly working towards the same overall objective. And so I want to turn it back to you, Julie, to kick us off on this last bit of the discussion around the orchestration work, particularly thinking now about that role and that set of activities in the context of societal change or systems change. And what are the challenges there, and how can we anticipate those and navigate them more effectively as we think about that role in particular?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Gail and Esther. You highlighted some of the critical challenges, and you very also eloquently and clearly presented the way in which you've been tackling them. So you're right to point to the key challenge faced by orchestrators. Effective orchestrators are able to build the necessary trust across the people and organizations involved, right? So that, you know, the change can become a reality. And in our book, we actually give the example of Maria Rashid in Argentina. So I want to just briefly share that example. Maria was one of the organizers in Argentina, you know, like in the whole movement to legalize same-sex marriage. And so what's interesting is that, as you know, Argentina is a Catholic country, and it was the first country in Latin America to pass the legislation. And it was actually one of the first countries in the world to do so, which is sort of very counterintuitive. So Maria was part of the movement, and she was one of the leaders in a group of lesbian organizers who pushed against the status quo. And so she participated in launching the sustaining of the movement. And she recounted how they faced obviously tremendous resistance to be expected from a mighty force with centuries of experience with power, the Catholic Church, right? And that they expected. But then what made things much more complicated for them is that she explained to us that they confronted fierce opposition from gay activists within the Argentinian LGBTQ+ community, who actually favored the civil union legislation over same-sex marriage. And so during the early phases of the campaign, there were real fault lines, right, within the movement, with people pushing in different directions. And so Maria explained to us that as the movement was launching and they were gaining momentum, she had to make at some point a critical decision together with the other organizers, which was to really reach out and try to include those who initially were really just in favor of civil unions and didn't want to see the legislation on same-sex marriage be promoted the way it was. And so she herself explained that that was the moment when she had to go from just being an agitator and an innovator to becoming an orchestrator, and now embracing the fact that yes, these people would have to be on the podium with them, that they would have to also get the congratulations like they did for making this whole change a reality, because that was the way to make the legislation a reality and to accelerate the movement for change. She said that was a really difficult moment and that it took them time to also build the trust to make that happen. But she also understood that it was a pivotal moment and that had they not done that, they probably would not have been as effective as they were. So to me, this is an example of what you have to do as an orchestrator. It's about building the collaborative capacity. That's exactly what both Esther and Gail were talking about. And it is difficult work. And so those orchestrators are not only the ones building the bridges, right? They are the trusted people and organizations. They have to create spaces for other actors to get together. And in these spaces, you have to make sure that people get to speak the same language, and you cannot assume that they do. You have to translate, you have to facilitate, you have to make sure that the bridges you built continue to be there. So I know it's exhausting work. I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King, who said, social change makers have to accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And I do realize when I say that the work of orchestrators is so hard, but it is so critically important. And we have to find ways to keep that hope alive.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. Back over to Esther and Gail for any reflections on orchestration and the ways in which you have been able in your own work and with your organizations to navigate these challenges, and also, personally to be able to keep that hope alive despite these difficult moments in doing this work.
Gail, would you like to go, or okay? I'll share an example from the past 2 years, actually. And I'll start with the fact that at the start of the pandemic, we decide to digitize a major part of our business operation. In the book, there's mention of the fact that you can drive change when there's significant moment. A natural disaster or an economic situation or a technological innovation. So we use the start of the pandemic to digitize a major part of our business operation. And that enabled us to really increase the financial capital that we had. And these were resources that we were able to devote to philanthropy programs and policy initiatives, and we were able to do that at scale. The pandemic also created this really interesting moment of agitation, and that was a moment focused on possible disruption with healthcare systems, alongside the public attention that was focused on what was happening in hospitals. The public became aware of the long-standing problems in our healthcare systems, including shortage of healthcare workers in the US and Canada. This was true before the pandemic, but there was a light shining on this situation. And this was really a moment for us to leverage, because there are hundreds of thousands of internationally educated healthcare professionals in the US and Canada who don't have access to those professions, mostly because they were educated internationally. And we leveraged this moment. We identified pathways and solutions to the shortage of healthcare workers, leveraging the fact that there were thousands of internationally educated health professionals. We engaged key professionals key influencers at the state and provincial levels throughout North America and successfully urged them to call on political parties to commit to a strategy for integrating internationally educated health professionals. This has led to so many changes across the United States and Canada, creating temporary licenses, which hopefully will turn into permanent access to these professions. And we just use the moment of the crisis to create additional access, to create new laws, new regulations, new opportunities for these professionals. So this was an incredible moment. There's so much more work to do, but that's what you do in these moments.
Thank you, Esther. It's a great example. We have just a few minutes left. I want to turn to Gail for a few final thoughts on this question of orchestration and doing that work.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what I feel to say in this time is that the crises that we're in right now are, in my estimation, 5,000 years in the making. They've been speeding up in the last 500 years, and they're based on a paradigm of domination where it makes use of the success to success mechanism. It goes after resources, it's focused on growth. And when it gets more resources, it uses it to get more resources, and it moves around the globe and extracts and excretes. And it's a shape-shifting system that is willing at times, if it has to allow some changes. So, okay, women are allowed in the workforce, but on the basis of this system. And I think that orchestration needs to move up into a different layer. And I think there was sort of some part of Julian Kawartha's book that spoke to that, which is how you move into a sort of higher purpose, and how you can work with organizations that are feeling into what needs to replace this system, which is going to bring itself down in some ways or other, or move into sort of eco-fascism. And interestingly, I think it really relates. So if you come across Ian McGilchrist's work on the brain hemispheres or Jill Bolte Taylor's work, we have these 4 different characters in our head dependent on our brains, and the sort of left hemisphere that's in this mechanistic world has come to dominate. It's a special feature of Western civilization. The right hemisphere is the one that's visionary and in connection with life, and there's something that has to shift at that level. So I've been sort of interested in this concept of, I just give it a silly phrase for now, magic sauce, like ketchup, right? We're not, as Audre Lorde said, I don't think the master's tools are going to dismantle the master's house. And to the extent we could be students of power, sort of the other side, the left hemisphere dominated, whatever it's up to, is also, right? And we stay in this complete sort of battle. So what is it that lifts and rather than pushes is an attraction force? And I think there's some ingredients in that. There's vision, is what we've talked about. And there's wisdom that you feel in your bodies and you feel in the collective. There's a sense of togetherness and there's a sense of agency. And I think that we have a time now where there's something that wants to be sort of lifted. And to my mind, it maybe involves the making of oaths to the world that needs to be born in these times. I think it moves beyond the simple orchestration to make some changes within the system. It moves into a stage of lifting together in spirit for the changes that are needed. And I think it's a really exciting and also daunting task to try and do that. But it's what a time to be alive, eh?
Thank you so much. That is a wonderful place to conclude. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Esther. And thank you, Julie, for joining us today for a really stimulating and engaging conversation. And thanks to all of you who joined as well in the audience for your questions, for your comments, for your engagement Really wonderful to have everyone here today. Please keep an eye out for our next Insight for Action seminar series, which is to be scheduled for June. And we look forward to seeing you there. Have a wonderful day, everyone, whatever your time zone.